who has been a resident here at Tide Point for the past 23 years. Mieke Smit was born on an island in the province of Zeeland, the Netherlands. She was the oldest of 6 children. Her father was a botanist and bulb grower, and Mieke had an idyllic childhood. The invasion of Hitler's army changed all that when she was 8 years old, and the country started living under German occupation. The next 5 years were difficult and left her with many sad memories. She's going to tell our story. Welcome, Mieke Smit.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Lee, for your nice introduction. You should think I'm quite part of the scenery by now, after all these years. I would like to start by saying that in contrast to my predecessors here, I am not going to tell the story of a brilliant career. I was a trailing spouse. 5 countries, 15 houses, almost 90 years. You can see, you can move around. It was an interesting period, I can say that. And I have come to look at my life as an experience in lifelong learning. And I have met so many wonderful people that I could not leave behind, that I have made them the plants, the flowers, the bushes, and the trees of my life. So I'm inviting you to join me on a guided tour of the garden of my life. Let's see what the first slide shows. As you see, this is a map of the Netherlands. It's not a really good map, although it does show all the different provinces. What I do want to make a few remarks to make clear what I'm going to tell you later. Holland is divided mostly with rivers that you can't see, but they go from east to west. Rotterdam is about here. And so this part of Holland did not get...
They say they can't hear you. Can everybody hear?
Oh, okay. Okay, I will turn around.
And we're going to have to add some...
Welcome to the garden of my life. And we go back to the Netherlands, where I obviously was born. And for one thing, you see the whole coastline, which has dunes. And one of the main objects of the Germans was to defend themselves to a possible invasion across the North Sea. And so they fortified that whole dune ridge. Then also I want to show, I did show you the line of the rivers. As you all remember, in 1944, we had the big invasion in Normandy. This is what the Germans had been expecting, except they didn't know where it would happen. And so they fortified the whole Dutch coast, and also all these islands. I was born here. And in order to make themselves safer, they decided in March 1944, so it was 2 months before the invasion, to inundate our island and send the people away. So you know that was happening. So the invasion was a big success. As you know, France was liberated in that summer of 1944. And Paris was liberated in August. The Allies rolled through France and southern Belgium and southern Holland, and then at the Battle of Arnhem, they were stopped. The bridge too far, as you may remember. So the people who were in this part of Holland were fine. In the southern part were fine, but the people in the northern part were waiting for the Allies to arrive, and they didn't come. And so they didn't liberate this northern part of Holland until May 1945, which made for a very crucial period in my life because that's where we were. So when I refer to this, I hope you can remember that the southern part of Holland was liberated and the northern part was not. Now, I go to the second. This is my province of Zeeland. And you see this big island. This is the island where I was born, more or less here, which is higher and with dunes. It is a village twice the size of Hilton Head, an island twice the size of Hilton Head, but with about half of the population. So around 1940, I would say that there may be about 20,000 people. It has all these little villages, but it has one little town called Zierikzee, which is a medieval town, and all the secondary education takes place there. So from all the villages, all the kids, all the teenagers had to converge on this little town, which was kind of fun when I was going to high school. So then I want to tell you something else. In 1953, as some of you may remember, there was a huge flood. This province, of course, is part of an island delta and has dealt with floods since the Middle Ages. And nobody thought it would happen again, but it did. And this whole area was flooded in 1953, and almost 2,000 people drowned. So it was a huge catastrophe. And our island was so damaged and was underwater for 9 months before they could repair the dikes and get the land going again, that it took a lot of effort and work to get back to normal function. Of course, it kills all the trees, the salt water. So now this is the coat of arms of my island, the Dutch lion, and in this part of Holland it is struggling and emerges because it has come back and did not drown. I think it's a beautiful flag and meaningful to me. My parents married very young. My father was an orphan at 19, and of his 6 siblings, 5 had left for other countries. So he was quite alone with his older brother, with whom together he was taking over his father's business, the bulb growing business. And it was quite a substantial business because he exported to England. Since he was very lonely, imagine he was 19 years old, he had known my mother for a couple of years, they decided to get married at 20 and built this house in 1930. I mean, I cannot imagine doing that now, but they did. And I was born in that house, and so all 5 of my siblings were. And it's still a beautiful house. I saw it for the last time 6 years ago. It's one of the prettiest houses in the village. The village had about 1,600 people. The iconic windmill is across the street from the house. It made wheat for the whole village, and every morning the horse-drawn cart would go out and distribute to the bakers. It's just still a beautiful mill. My father was not only a bulb grower, but he was also a botanist, and he was constantly experimenting with bulbs and cross-pollination and new species. He invented several new species. This is one of the results. He got a gold medal for it, and it is now the iris that you see in all the floral decorations all over the world. And I can remember how he came into the kitchen one morning carrying it and showing it to my mother and saying, "I think this is it." Making new species takes a long time. It's a lot of work. So this is called Professor Blauw, and Blauw in Dutch is the same as blue, after his professor at the university. But when you see it, think of me, because it has everything to do with my own history. They started a family, of course. What else do you do when you live in a village? And I had a little sister, and we were the first 2 of 6, and you will see some of the others as we go on. My sister now lives in Austin, Texas. Our idyllic life, of course, when I was 6 years old, I started going to school, and that was the beginning of my lifelong learning. School was heaven to me. It was a small 3-room schoolhouse with 3 teachers. Each had 2 grades, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm sure the level was not up to snuff, but it was a wonderful place for me to start. When I was 8 years old, one morning we woke up to the sound of little fighter planes, bombings, and shootings. We had, of course, all heard that the Germans were preparing for war. Austria had been invited, Czechoslovakia was. But the Dutch were sort of naively thinking, oh, well, we're neutral, they won't do that to us. But they did. Hitler had big aspirations to take over all of Western Europe. And so they started bombing our little airfield where the Dutch Air Force had a few planes. We knew there was fighting at the eastern border, and after a few days, they firebombed Rotterdam. Now, it destroyed the whole ancient center of the city. 800 people died, and 85,000 people lost their homes. So that was a permanent scar for a long time. And since they threatened to bomb all other urban population concentrations, the Dutch government just capitulated, and the Queen and the rest of the royal family went to London. The Germans quickly overran the whole country. I can still remember standing by the side of the road and watching the tanks and the trucks, and then later the marching soldiers singing their marching songs. They were crisp and young, and their dark, their polished boots, and they were now the new owners. They came and occupied the whole place. So where do you put a couple of hundred soldiers? They immediately took over my father's warehouses, where he kept and stored and worked on the bulbs, got them ready for export. They took out all the inner structures and built bunks. I mean, they were dormitories. They were right next to our house on the property. They built a big kitchen, an outside kitchen, and and bathrooms, and there were all these soldiers. So they got pretty busy, because pretty soon they were building, and I got this from the internet, but where I lived, they were built into the dunes. And the dunes were wide. It took an hour to walk from our house to the sea. So you can imagine, it was not just the little dunes that we have here in Hilton Head, but high dunes that were a hard place to work in. They immediately, of course, took all the available men. My father had quite a good number of employees, because bulbs are very labor intensive. They are all planted by hand and taken out by hand. And everybody else, young men, were just requisitioned to help with this reconstruction. They also came to our house and said, we're going to use your guest room for 2 officers. So now our house was pretty, but it was not the Western Inn. And it had 1 bathroom, and it had 4 young children. And so every evening, two German officers would just walk in through the front door, go up the steps, use the room, go back in the morning. I don't know how my mother did this, but it happened. But that's what happens when you have that power. And so it was a strange time. And on the one hand, my life and that of my younger siblings went on. I went to school, but we had less and less freedom and less things available. We got the rations for food and so forth. But it was agricultural, and we had enough to eat. Now I'm coming fast forward to 1944. And so in March of 1944, the Germans decided that the invasion was now imminent. They knew it. I mean, everybody knew it. It was going to happen in June. but they still didn't know where. And in order to save their back, they decided that all the inhabitants on the island had to leave. Now, by then, nobody had a car anymore. They had taken all kind of, our cars, tractors that farmers had, trucks. So there was an enormous exodus of people, mostly farmers, but also from that little town, all going to that one little ferry at the end of the island, because at that time there were no other connections with the outside world. It was totally an isolated island. There were hundreds of people that had never been off the island, that had never lived anywhere else. It was very isolated in those days. So they all had to leave. Now our village was not evacuated because they could not inundate it. It was too high. However, they did tell my father that he had to leave because they suspected that he was part of the underground, which he was, and they didn't want that kind of guy in the area. And they also wanted our house. They immediately took it as officers' quarter. So what do? We didn't have a car or any transportation. My mother was not very well, and we had 2 small babies. My father found a chartered, I don't know how he did that. There's so many things I would now like to ask him. He got an ambulance. And so they packed my mother with the 2 babies in the ambulance, and the whole content of our cellar, which was these glass jars with vegetables that she had, prepared over the summer, because it was we had a big kitchen garden, so there were the beans, the carrots, the peas, all in these glass jars, and they all went into the ambulance because we figured we might need them, and we did. And he took us, the four of us, with 2 big suitcases and our clothes, and took the little tuk tram to the ferry and up to Rotterdam, where we spent the night. And we went to my grandparents' house, which was very close to Haarlem, where the Keukenhof is, where the bulb area is, because that's where my mother came from. Now, my grandparents' house was an old house. I mean, an older house than ours, certainly not as comfortable. And there were already 6 people living in it, my grandparents and my mother's younger siblings, 3 girls in their early 20s and 1 uncle who was very ill, gravely ill, and my grandmother who had tuberculosis and was on a daybed in the living room. So it was not particularly an ideal situation to move in a family of 8, but we had no choice. You couldn't reserve a hotel. Hotels weren't there. I mean, we settled in. I must say, when I look back, of course I remember it very well. I was 8, 10, 11. I was 10 when we got there. Yeah, I was 13 when we left. We were assigned a little corner room in the house because you can't have 6 kids running through the whole house with 2 sick people. And where we had a table and had to do everything we did. It had a stove. Of course, the house had no central heating. And we settled in. We were divided over the bedrooms, 3, 4 to a room and the attic, and started living there. Now, in the summer, that was still okay. We arrived in March, and in June, we were all excited about the invasion in Normandy and the progress of the Allies. But as the summer progressed, and it got to be fall, and it was clear that they were not coming where we were, it got very hard. And in the fall, it was very clear that there was going to be a huge shortage of food. And people started trying to go to the farming areas and get food. One of the lucky things of that whole period, I have to say, is that as soon as we had arrived the previous year, I went to school. I got into 5th grade. And it was the best school you could imagine. Here was a school that was preparing students to go and study in higher education and go to university. And I still remember the teacher and how we learned and how incredibly enriching that was to me after this other little school, which was just not up to what it should be. Anyway, that was the one good thing about that period. So I kept walking to school. It was a 45-minute walk because there was no other transportation, but I did. And at one point, my sister came with me too, but she doesn't have such good memories of that period. But then life started getting really very ugly and difficult, because here we were, 16, sometimes there was some uncles, 14, 16 people to that house. And winter came, and it was one of the most severe winters. It's still referred to in Dutch as the hunger winter. In the end, 16,000 people died of a famine, because the bulb area is not a productive area. They don't grow vegetables or potatoes or beans or wheat. So people started going out to get, and all we had were bicycles. Now, since the men were all hunted down almost to go and work in the German war industry, because so many soldiers were all over. So the Germans needed people at home to work. You know that 500,000 Dutch men worked in the German factories. So you can see the man didn't dare walk in the streets. If we saw a German stop in front of our house, we'd warn our dad and my uncle to go and hide. And they had hiding places in the house where they, double ceilings and stuff. Very nerve-wracking, I might say. And he did not dare go out on his bicycle to get food. So it was my mother who would get on her old bicycle, and by the end of the war, we had no more rubber tires. There were little wooden strips in it, and she'd go for days, just to farmers, and come back with little bits of beans, and we started eating tulip bulbs and sugar beets, and now I don't recommend it, but if you're cooking sugar beets and want to reduce it to get the syrup, it takes hours. And the whole house is pervaded with this awful smell. I can still smell it. But anyway, we lived through it. I can remember my sister and I sitting with my sick uncle at night because we had no light, no electricity, and no heat. This is a very cold place to live. We would always talk about food and the wonderful things we were going to eat once the war was over. There was something I wanted to mention too. Well, oh yes, what do you do when you have no soap? We had sheets for 14 people and no hot water. They cut trees and heated water, but if you cannot properly wash, we all had lice. I can see my mother sitting us at the table with her fine comb and camphor oil. Remember the smell of camphor balls? And going through, and lice have eggs. It's not just chickens, but and she, every night she would clean us. And one of my sisters got scabies. They had to cut all her hair because all of the lesions on her head. So it was a very difficult time. My grandmother dwindled away. She died a week after the liberation because she just didn't get the food she did. But I spent quite a bit of time with her talking and just keeping her company. I will tell you one last thing of the horrors of this kind of a situation. My two aunts who lived in, also two of the three, would go out after curfew and go across the land behind my grandfather's land, behind the house to the railroad tracks. And you know how the tracks are held together by beams. They would go and loosen and come home with two beams, so we would have some firewood to burn. But think how dangerous that was. If they were caught, they would be shot. So anyway, in April, I think the world became aware of the fact that so many people were dying. People from The Hague would be walking in front of our house with baby carriages on their way north of Amsterdam. You know those distances. You spend a couple of days walking, and many people just fell aside the road from exhaustion. It was an amazing, I mean, I can hardly describe it. So the world became aware of this very dire situation of this very small population group, but very densely populated part of Holland. You know, these are the big cities: The Hague, Rotterdam, Leiden, Haarlem, Amsterdam. And the Swedish Red Cross started dropping food. And manna from heaven, I can tell you. I think there was more thankful prayer than ever before, because to have bread and sugar and butter and chocolate, and I can remember taking a piece of chocolate to bed with me and licking it, you know, just to make it last longer. So it was time the liberation actually happened. It happened on May 5th, and you cannot imagine how much adrenaline there was still left for people to start dancing in the street. I mean, even if you're emaciated, and we all were, there was still energy to celebrate. And in spite of the fact that my grandmother just only lived another week, and which was very hard to have that duality in our life of, the funeral and all that. It was one of these new realities that did not take very long to set in. We got so. Here were these. You should have seen these young soldiers. We call them the Tommies because they seem to all be called Tommy. English, Canadians, not many Americans. We were mostly liberated by Canadians and Brits, and they come and they are. This is spring, this is May, beautiful weather, and throw out cigarettes, Pall Malls, and all these, and food, cans of corned beef and what have you. So it was an amazing period in all of our lives. And of course, pretty soon, communication was reestablished, because up until then we had no idea what happened on our island. Were they still living? What had happened? What had happened to the family? My uncle was there and my cousins, but we did start communicating, and pretty soon my father found a truck that could carry us back to our island. Only a truck. We put mattresses in and some food, and we set out. I must say that just before that return, he received the totally, destroying him news that the team that he had been part of in the resistance had been betrayed as they were trying to get out to the island south of them, and they were caught at a dike, and the next day they were all hanged in the woods, in a place in the woods. And of each of them, 2 family members were made to watch. This left a scar on him, I think, all his life. But what I also want to say is, people use the term Nazi tactics quite lightly. But if you're not totally happy with what your government is doing, find some other way to say it, because that hurts. So we got on our truck. And so we started going down the rivers. Oh gosh, I still have 70 years to go. And as soon as we got to the first river, of course, there were no bridges. The Germans had blown up all the bridges, and after 6 weeks, this is the end of June, there were no really good ferries, but they managed. We got the truck on some kind of boat and got to the other side, and it took 2 days to get back to the island because it was so hard. And this is the only picture I'm showing, but we went through totally destroyed territory, and we could see how the fighting had just gone on and on for months, and how destroyed it was. And yet there were people there too, dancing in the street and waving at us and saying welcome back and helping us to get through and giving us food, because here we had this truck full of 6 kids, and we had one person with us who I don't remember exactly why or who he was, but he had a gun. He came with us to protect us on the way home, because nobody knew what obstacles we might still find. It was so shortly after the liberation. So we came back to our house, which needed everything, new furniture and cleaning. And I have a picture here that's maybe a little premature, but it was taken about a year after we came back, and it's in here. It shows my family, my mother and our 6 children in our garden in our own house, and we were back and very happy to be home. So what do you do next? You start living. Kids live in the moment, and we found our cousins, our old friends, and I immediately in the fall started going to my secondary school in that little medieval town. I want you to see the picture. It's iconic for that little town. It was just beautiful, inner harbor and so forth, and the school was totally geared to preparing students for university. I can remember all the teachers. They all had master's degrees and PhDs, and they were tops, and the classes were very small. It was a very elite, small group of students that took the entrance exam, and thanks to my good school up north, I got in. Now, I want to tell a happy story also, and I know I'm not going to be able to even halfway finish my talk, but I thought this part was important for you to know more than anything else. Very shortly after the war, my 2 uncles who had moved to Washington State, and their wives, of course, whom we didn't know, started sending packages. All kinds of things, clothes, shoes, food to us, because we had literally nothing left, and it took a long time for the industry to get going again. I mean, Western Europe was basically destroyed. Marshall help came, but it doesn't happen overnight. And my mother was always well organized. She had a good imagination, and at one point, the schools in Mount Vernon, Washington, one of the schools wanted to adopt our school and send things to each child. So my mother got busy, and she got every child organized, all their, boy, girl, and their sizes. And maybe 3 months later, or 4 months later, sometime later, arrived a whole truck full of packages, like 100 boxes of things addressed to each child. And it was so sensational. You can imagine an island where, everybody had been so deprived and where nothing ever happened. And all of a sudden there was this incredible influx of generosity and somebody who was doing something. So she called the American embassy and said, listen, this is such a wonderful event in our life. We want you to know about this. This is what, Americans are doing in Washington State. And they heard the call, and one day the cultural attaché, who was a lady, drove down in a Buick convertible. Now, if you remember 1948 Buick convertibles, that was a pretty impressive car. And in a country where all we ever saw at this point were small English cars, post-war English cars, this car made such an impression. She comes driving down, and she was there for the festive opening. I think my mother had undoubtedly gotten some ribbons and made it a very pretty ceremony. And there she was. All the kids had their package. Now, Miss Allen, as she was called, and my mother became great friends. And so she stayed in touch with us and with the family and with me. And when I was in my 5th year in this high school, she said, Mieke, you know, you're going to graduate from high school next year. Why don't you go and study in the United States? I was a good student, and I said, well, there's no way we could afford that. You know, she said, oh yeah, but there are scholarships. And she told me about, and you probably don't even know the story, about the senator from Arkansas, William Fulbright, who had had the wonderful idea, I would say the bright idea, that war surpluses in Europe should be sold and that the revenues could be used for international education. So we would never have wars like this. So people would know each other, and people who know each other don't start wars together. And so she told me that there were now scholarships available. And yes, a couple of months later was an announcement in the school on the bulletin board that students could apply, and I applied. And after about 2 or 3 interviews in The Hague at the Ministry of Education, I got the good news that I had received a scholarship to go and study in Oxford, Ohio. Now, nobody had ever heard of Oxford, Ohio, but we found it, and I found my way to Oxford, Ohio. Now, you can imagine coming from an island, coming from a war, coming from a really life full of worries and insecurity, to arrive on a college campus in a small town in Ohio was probably one of the best things that could happen to me. And I remember very distinctly that after a week, I felt like some big load had fallen off me. I didn't have to take care of anybody. I didn't have to worry about anything. Food was there. In fact, the food was so plentiful that I immediately gained 20 pounds. and I could pick all these courses that I was interested in. And even though the scholarship was for only 1 year, I think within 2 weeks I had decided for myself that I was going to stay as long as I could. And I worked hard, and some generous alumna extended my scholarship, and I got another 2 years, and I graduated in 3 years, and that was amazing. I mean, it was a learning experience. It was friends. It was Canton, Ohio. My new best friends took me home. And she's still my friend. She is 80, like I am, but in State College, Pennsylvania. And it was just a new freedom and a complete new way of learning and to find yourself and grow. So it was something I'm, of course, still very thankful for. It was certainly pivotal in my life because, and here I am graduating. I came back to the Netherlands and found, this was another very hard thing. I mean, quite aside from a culture shock, because after you've been away for 3 years from a country that was still just recuperating from the war, the island was so dead. My father, for the second time, lost all his crop because he had had the first inundation in the war, and then 9 years later with the big flood. They were struggling, and I decided that I was not going to go. I had had my turn. I was going to find a job, and I went to Amsterdam and got a job with the General Tire of Akron, Ohio, in their publicity department, translating folders from English into Dutch. And I love languages, and that was a fun job. There were many American companies that then settled in Europe after the war. Hendrik worked for Royal Typewriters. He worked for an American company after he'd gotten his MBA. So it was an interesting time, and I enjoyed it. As you go to everything with energy when you're 22 years old. And I also immediately found contacts like myself. There's a whole organization by the Holland America Institute of ex-Fulbrighters, people that had lived in the States, and the Americans that were the Fulbrighters that were studying and working in Amsterdam. So I went to one of their parties and put on my best dress and met Hendrik. And that dress I bought in my senior year, I still have it, and my friends here have seen me wear it at important anniversaries. It's still in my closet, and I never threw it out. So that's my happy dress. The little white polka dots are little hearts. So it is affectionately referred to in my family as the little heart dress. So we started dating and did not waste much time. Got married that same year, and here is our wedding picture. Hendrik's brother, my sister, my American friend, a violinist from Pennsylvania who had a Fulbright, and who was a professor at Pepperdine, and my brother. We had a wonderful wedding and started our life in a little town where Hendrik was running the typewriter operation, and immediately had as soon as we could, we had our first child. And then we decided to emigrate because we loved the United States. We had, there were a couple of years in between. But we loved the United States, and Holland was so crowded, and the weather was not very good. And we knew the States. We figured we had qualifications that would make it work. Now, we didn't take the Mayflower, but I think it's symbolic. We flew, and I have to admit, we flunked emigration. Because 2 houses and 2 children later, we were back in Brussels. Here's the second baby, the third, a little girl, and here we are in Brussels. Also for a typewriter company, Remington. And I just want you to see this beautiful building, which is one of my all-time favorites, this beautiful Belgian Gothic Brabant, the regional, and that great square in Brussels. I won't talk about the Brussels time because I don't have time, but I do want to move on. We moved to Frankfurt after that because they also needed somebody who spoke German. After they needed somebody who spoke French, they needed somebody to speak German. And so we moved to Frankfurt. And that was 20 years exactly after the war was over. And so we got to see firsthand how Germany was working and repairing itself and gaining its rightful place in the Western European nations. They rebuilt their country, but not only that, they rebuilt their prestige and their place in Europe. And that was good for us. That was a healing experience. We could communicate with them. We could appreciate them. And as it has continued, Germany, of course, has become so good at also restoring art to the rightful owners. And one of the things they have done also is that they have taken this piece of history and put it in their history books and recognized it fully, which is not, as we all know, an easy thing to do. I recently saw a quote by a German diplomat talking about that period, who said, one has to love one's country with a broken heart. And I think that was beautiful. Now, another thing that happened while we were in Frankfurt, which changed my life, and probably his too, Hendrik bought me, for our 10th wedding anniversary, a Steinway piano. I had been playing the piano all these years. That was just something I did on the side. But the Steinway piano is now in its 7th home. It's right here. And it is a wonderful instrument. And it was an important part of what happened in my life. So here we are, happy in Germany and adjusting and speaking German. And next thing we know is he says, I got this incredible possibility to go to Holland. And I said, oh no. I already speak the language. I know how they eat. I know it's for sale in the supermarkets. So there's nothing for me to learn. He said, yeah, but it's... And I said, we won't be able to find a house because Holland had such a housing shortage after the war. He said, well, the company has bought a house for the CEO because they knew they would never get a good man to run that company, and it was factories and a sales organization, unless I had a house. So I drove down from Frankfurt to this little town, Breda, in the southern part of Holland, and was interviewed by a couple of people, and he obviously took the job. This is the house. You see the good old-fashioned, wonderful, big, roomy Dutch house. By then, our children were this size, so we did make progress. They were beginning to... We also immediately bought a boat. And of course, the families were delighted. Our friends just laughed their heads off. Here we are, flunked immigrants. 10 years later, they're back. But he had his job, and it was a very good, it turned out to be a good decision. But since I was still a little bored and a little doubtful about who was I, so-and-so's wife, so-and-so's mother, does my brain still work? I looked around for something, and yes, I enrolled at a nearby university in a 4-year advanced French program. Now, that was a lot of work, but I isolated myself. I had a good excuse that I didn't, join a lot of women's little things that I wasn't interested in. And I went back to school, and I met some really wonderful people, all part of my garden. And in 4 years, I got a degree. And even before I finished, the school, the College of Tourism needed a sub for French and said, oh, please come and help us out. The teacher is ill and can't find anybody. I said, well, I've never done this. I've never taught. But I'm willing to try, and if it doesn't work, it's not my fault. Well, I taught for a couple of years and loved it. And so 10 years in Breda, and then something else happened. Hendrik by then had worked for European industry for almost 20 years, and the U.S. Embassy in Brussels was looking for somebody with experience in European industry, who spoke French, who spoke Dutch, and they couldn't find anybody. Not easily. And they offered him the job as commercial counselor at the embassy, which he first said, oh no, I've never worked for the government, if you're in private industry, you just don't do that. But it sounded good, and I said, it'll be wonderful, the kids are gone, and we'll have fun in Brussels. And to me, going to Brussels was a chocolate meets peanut butter moment. I loved it, and there was so much to learn and so much to do. And I'll show you a few pictures. This was the swearing-in ceremony at the embassy with the ambassador, Charlie Price. And of course, many important visitors come, but I will limit that. But this is Vice President Bush. This is part of the culture of Brussels. This is a 15th century Gothic church that they have never stopped renovating, and that I got to know and love so well that in the course of 15 years, I ended up giving guided tours in it. I had made it my own. But anyway, I'm ahead of myself. What I loved about our time in Brussels was, again, there was so much to learn. We were part of a really very elite and thin layer of all that embassy, that international, which was fascinating because if you speak 4 languages, you can really find a lot of interesting people. But there was also the city of the European Union, NATO headquarters, all the embassies, and there were a lot of foreigners settling down in Brussels with families. And, what do you do if you don't speak French or Dutch? And how do you find schools? And how do you find doctors? And how do you go shopping? And for that, there was already, when I was there, and we're now talking about 1984, the Community Help Service. And that was a volunteer organization started by a couple of people who saw that these people needed help, and I immediately got involved in that. And of course, it was fundraising because you need funds to do that. But I can remember taking newly arrived people grocery shopping just to show them how to find things, and so that was interesting. But a big city like Brussels has very old parts, also has a lot of not so well-off people, not so privileged people. And one of my tennis friends asked me one day if I would like to volunteer and drive with the blind. And the Braille League in Brussels, in that old part of Brussels, was very active because there were so many of them living alone in small apartments, in basements, in attics, and just fending for themselves, that needed entertainment and meeting each other, that needed socializing. And I started driving, maybe 5 or 6, depending on who was going, but I always had 3 in the car. And weaving my way through Brussels traffic while they were all talking because they're so happy to see each other. It was a revealing period because I ended up being very good friends with these people and taking them to doctor's appointments, or if it was a diabetic, helping to find the right foods, doing grocery shopping for them, or reading stories to them. It was very good for my soul because I could come home from an afternoon with them and put on my fancy clothes and go to some really elegant dinner or a private concert with Jesse Norman, and not lose my sense of perspective, because the world is not always fair to everybody, as we all know. So again, the Brussels experience was incredibly rich and fulfilling, and just I look back on those years. It's probably the happiest time of my life because it was it had so many facets. Then it comes an end to everything. We decided it was time to go. Yeah, I'm almost done, but I'll finish quickly. We decided that it was time to come home. We had been coming to Hilton Head and realized that we had not lived in the States for about 40 years. So we didn't really know, but we did have a condo in Sea Pines. And then Tideport was going up, and we said, this is a perfect place because we want our freedom, we want to travel, and this is where we can move. And so we moved in here, and I will show you a few pictures. We did a lot of traveling. Oh, I do want to show you this picture of my family. Now, here's all 6 of us. This is the last picture because we were my parents. You see my mother, who used to ride her little bicycle. She was in her 80s then. And my 4 sisters and my dad. So I think that we all survived I mean, when you think of it, we were the survivors. And these are our two dads. My Hendrik's dad, of course, I'm sure you recognize the family, and mine on the other side at one of our wedding receptions. I think it's a great picture. I wanted you to see that because they too survived. And so we come to Tide Point, and Tide Point is rebranding its name from Hyatt to V, and they used my picture for their new publicity. And then what it says is, when it comes to age, I'm playing my own song. And I thought this is a wonderful picture. It was everywhere, on buses, in catalogs. That's a long time ago, obviously. Oh, we did travel. I will. This is the Potala Palace in Lhasa, Tibet. We did do all our traveling. But then one of our big trips was in the Black Sea, and this is where we met Dasha. Now, most of you know Dasha. She's been our adopted child for 18 years now, practically, or 15. And she was 13 years old when we heard her play in Odessa. And she's now 29 and has her doctorate. And you've all contributed in one way or the other to her success. And so she came back in November with her husband, who is a cellist. And this is the last picture I have of them. And this is our last, yes, this is a recent, 6 years ago, family reunion. There's only 4 of us now, but you see the family resemblance of the four sisters in Holland. And this was what we have produced since then. This is a family reunion 3 years ago in Canada. And our 2 sons and daughter and this is the last picture of the 25th anniversary of Tide Point, where we had a wonderful evening. I have left out a lot of stories, but I think I got most of it in. I want to say one more thing. Abraham Lincoln said, "It's not the years in your life that count, it's what you put in those years that does." And I think...
Thank you, Mieke. What a wonderful story. Just think how lucky we are in America during World War II. Compare it to...
Oh.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Next month, March 14th, actually, we have our next speaker is Pat Ravella. I think you'd be very interested because Pat has a PhD. She was a lieutenant commander in U.S. Air Force and a flight instructor. So please put her on the calendar for March 14th. And another big thank you to Mieke. Thank you for coming.
Do you have any questions? I mean, is there anybody who wants to ask something? Are there any... Oh, everybody wants to go have dinner.